Just quick about me, my white coat. Um, I'm actually a former student of Marx. I graduated Yale with my doctorate in 2004. I've never really left. I'm still affiliated with Yale. I live currently in Israel. I'm a professor of law at a private university here in Israel in the city called Herzliya. It's sort of like the Silicon Valley of Israel. Um, After I went to Mark's lab, I did what the natural thing to do is, and then I went to law school. I followed law school where I focused on intellectual property, and I went and did a couple postdocs in law and technology. I then practiced law for a number of years in Silicon Valley, moved to Israel, practiced law for like 7 years, 5 years, it's not too many years in Israel. And then I ended up becoming a professor of law in the law school here. Along the way, I picked up some other stuff. So for example, I'm a certified information privacy professional, particularly in Europe, not in the US. So I have some ideas of privacy. So I will leave it at that. I should say that my group here in Israel is very keen on sort of lots of collaboration. We're now working with a whole host of students from Singapore, collaborating on a whole number of projects at the intersection of law, science, and technology. So if you have an interest in that, my email is somewhere on the internet. Feel free to reach out to me, and we'll see what we can do to collaborate. Oh, another caveat I should mention is that I like movies. I tend to sort of wander off into movie space sometimes, and I apologize. I'm teaching actually a great class where we essentially just watch movies. We watch Black Mirror, we watch some movies, we talk to Hollywood screenwriters from, the people who've written major motion pictures and looking at the intersection of law, science, and technology through the lens of film. So if you're interested in that, we can talk about that too. So let's talk about a movie. Anyone see the movie? Well, I don't know if anyone's actually there. I just see black boxes with names, except for one person. Oh, there's a face. Look at that. Thank you, Bradley. And thank you, Anusha. And thank you, Raghav, who I think has the best idea, and that is putting the pronunciation of his name in his Zoom image, which is very, very helpful. Although it kills your last name. Now I don't know what your last name is, but I know how to pronounce your first name. So I don't know if you guys seen this movie. It's a great movie, Moneyball. Starts Brad Pitt in I have to assume a pre-tattooed Jonah Hill. I don't know if you guys seen Jonah Hill walking down the street recently. That guy has tattoos everywhere. He had some body images, I think, at the beginning, and he's no longer has any body images, it seems. So anyways, Moneyball is a really cool movie. Rotten Tomatoes loved it. And it's sort of the story of this guy, Billy Beane, who uses big data, essentially, right? Before they had big data, he uses big data in 2002 to try and build up a team of misfits from no budget whatsoever. So the Oakland A's in 2002, have under $40 million in salaries. The Yankees have 120 million. And so Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill team up together. Jonah Hill is officially from Yale in this movie, although I think in real life, the actor he's playing, the person he's playing is not from Yale. It's some sort of composite of people. And I think it's really cool because, they take all this data that they have about these baseball players and they succeed. This is the real life. The A's win 20 in a row in 2002. This was unheard of at the time. I mean, again, it's a group of misfits. And it's really cool how they took all this data that we collect, with, essentially crazily by rabid fans, all this crazy data collection on athletes, and this can then be translated into real wins. And that was a great movie. So if you haven't seen it, watch it. If you haven't watched it, you should see it. But it raises this issue of if it's not only athletes that we can collect a lot of data on. And I know you just learned big data, you just learned machine learning, and so you appreciate that big data is basically the food that feeds the machine learning monster. And so anyone who wants to apply any sort of artificial intelligence sort of algorithms on a large scale needs access to information. And one particular group of people that are looking to do that and need access to large pieces of information is the government of China. So, you know, what was done in baseball, in all sports effectively, is now going to be, you know, every couple of years they say we're going to do it, we're going to do it. Now they're really going into it. So there's social engineering, social credit in China, where essentially, depending on what region of China you're in, because different regions, they have different groups applying different rules, but essentially they're collecting all this data on individuals through what I think is the largest collection of street cameras on the planet. So they're collecting data. You know, they want to know if you're jaywalking. They want to know if you're speaking loudly and unpleasantly to your neighbors. They want to know if you are helpful to your neighbors. They're not only collecting that sort of data, they're using also data collected manually by, for lack of better, you know, words, narcs on the street. So people that are, you know, just walking around, busybodies, you know, people with nothing else to do, busybodies walking around on the street, collecting data on their neighbors. And this is sort of an extreme version of what happens when there's no privacy, when the government just collects data and they use it to score individuals. And this has real life implications in China. There are people already that can't travel extensively in China because they don't have a high enough score. Anyone see the Netflix, anyone see the Black Mirror show Nosedive? Right, written by the great Mike Schur, who also did Parks and Rec and The Good Place, a little bit of The Office. So no, and also Rashida Jones, who was also in all of those things, although I don't think Rashida Jones was in The Good Place. I take that back. So no, this is real life Nosedive. This is, you can't travel on airplanes, you can't go on trains, or you have to be the last person on the train. Because we've collected all this data on you, you have absolutely no semblance of any privacy. And this is the reality. This is a growing reality. This will soon be the reality for all of China, but this is a growing reality in China, that a extreme lack of privacy leads to Big Brother, effectively. Now, it's not only Big Brother that's collecting our data. There's a lot of little brothers collecting our data. There is a great story that was on the front page of the New York Times a couple years back. It was a young girl, 15 years old, who out of nowhere started getting coupons from Target with baby products, diapers, formula, things like that. And the father was incensed by this Target, this large corporation that is for some reason sending coupons implying that his daughter, his 15-year-old sweetheart daughter, is pregnant. And so he angrily called up Target. I guess in those days you could call up Target. I don't know if you still can call up Target, but he called up Target and he said, "What are you doing? My daughter is 15 years old. This is disgusting that you're sending my daughter coupons related to pregnancy." And Target said, "Well, we're really sorry, but you know, your daughter leaks data wherever she goes. Whenever she shops at Target, she uses her Target card and we collect information and things like that. And what we've noticed is your daughter does collecting all this data from your daughter's shopping habits. What we've noticed is that your daughter is doing exactly what women in their first trimester of pregnancy are doing. And so we assume your daughter's pregnant. I don't know, she's buying shea butter, or she's getting pickles and ice cream. By the way, my wife's in her first pregnancy, definitely pickles and ice cream. It never repeated itself, but there was pickles and ice cream. So, you know, the daughter denied it, the father denied it. Target said, "I'm sorry, the data that we've collected on you suggests otherwise," and Target was right. By the way, I don't know how many of you shop at the supermarkets. I shouldn't be telling you this, but I'll tell you this anyways. I really shouldn't, but I will. If you're ever shopping, right, one of the ways, insidious ways that they collect all our private data, including our private shopping habits, which includes everything that we're buying. One of the insidious ways that they do that is that they use sort of, these sort of customer cards, customer loyalty cards, where, oh, we'll give you 5% off on this purchase if you use your customer loyalty card. And it's a hard bargain, right? Should I get the money off at Stop and Shop? I assume there's Stop and Shop still on Whaley. Yeah, I used to go there. So do I get my money off at Stop and Shop, or do I keep my private information? And there is another way, and that is, and this will work across the entire country, is rather than giving the supermarket your private information in order to get your discount at their store, you can simply give them your phone number. Of course, giving your phone number is just giving the phone number for your card, and so they know who you are. And so guaranteed, every supermarket, every drugstore in the United States, there's one phone number that you can always give that will guarantee you privacy, and that is Jenny's phone number. Everyone knows Jenny's phone number? Tommy Two Tones? You know the Tommy Two Tones? They were like a band in like the 70s, 80s, right? Jenny's phone number is 867-5309. Attached 203 is the area code in New Haven. What's 203? 203-867-5309. Walk in to Stop and Shop tomorrow, and you will see that that phone number will always work, no matter where you go, and that will guarantee you the privacy. And so if you're 15 and you're pregnant and you don't want your father to know, give them Jenny's phone number. That's the way to do it. Now, of course, we leak data not only through our customer loyalty cards, but everywhere we're leaking data. And part of the reason we're leaking all this data, and the people that are vacuuming up this data, are FANG. I don't know, when I was growing up, I was a big fan of Cobra. So FANG, these are the guys that are collecting our data. Not this FANG, but this FANG. These guys are collecting our data, and they are essentially telling us we have no privacy. Everything that you tell them is sent into algorithms, collected, and done to sell you more things. Just to give you an example of how much information you guys are giving, this is every minute on the internet. I don't know, 147,000 users upload images every minute to Facebook, right? 404,000 hours worth of Netflix is being watched. Of course, this is 2020, so this is during the pandemic, so this might go down in a bit. It's crazy how much information we voluntarily give to these corporations. This is our privacy that we are exchanging. We're exchanging giving them this private information in exchange for free services. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the film The Great Hack, right? This sort of exemplifies what Facebook is doing with our data, what they can do with our data, how they can use our data to manipulate elections, how they can use our data to manipulate nearly everything. Now, one thing that I think should be appreciated, and I don't know if you guys also saw this show on Netflix, part of Black Mirror. Anyone see Smithereens with Topher Grace, right? There was a shirtless Topher Grace half the time. He's a very sort of Jesus figure. He walks around, long hair, long robe. Anyways, this is an episode of Black Mirror where the take-home message for you is that the government is inept. This Facebook-like company called Smithereens has all of our data and knows everything about us and can use that information to manipulate us. Now, that is not necessarily the case. And in fact, if you speak to people in the area of cybersecurity and cyber intelligence, they'll tell you that the tools that governments can use to assess our private information is overwhelming. I'll give you a quick example. How many of you use WhatsApp? Okay. And you like WhatsApp because there's end-to-end encryption, right? You know, you can see what's going on. The terrorists that you're messaging on the other side can see what's going on, but the company in the middle and the government can't see what's going on, right? That's the assumption you're making. It's a false assumption because the government isn't in the middle. The government's on your phone. If it wants to be, the government's on your phone looking at the same screen that you're looking at. So, you know, this perception that social media companies perhaps have more access to data than the governments have is likely false. I mean, you know, we all know Edward Snowden. I mean, some of us know him personally. I don't. But you know, the government is collecting our private information and using it for whatever it needs to do. It, you know, anyone here willing to give the government their private information? No. In reality, I think what Snowden and probably Obama said at the time was, if you're not a bad person, you have nothing to fear. And I think that's really the case. For the most part, the government doesn't have the resources to go through all the data that it collects. And it's really very targeted in terms of what it's trying to access and who it's trying to learn about. And so I really don't think that we have much to fear. I mean, we'll get to, you know, what that means in terms of our privacy, but it doesn't mean we have much to fear. Now, of course, like I said, you know, before, and like Smithereens implies, is that the large social media companies are collecting a lot of data on us and are collecting a lot of private information on us. And I think what you've learned from your big data sort of classes is that in the world of big data, nothing is really private because we can take lots of different little pieces of tangential data and plugging it into the relevant algorithms, we can extract really private information. So simple example would be Facebook. Just from your likes alone, we can tell your sexual orientation. We can tell your gender. We can know your political affiliations. We can know, you know, are you outgoing or reserved? Just from your likes alone, right? Not even very private information. In fact, the information that we knowingly and willingly give over to the world because we want people to, you know, we want our friends to feel good about us. So we reciprocate with likes and they reciprocate with likes. So this is information that we willingly give over to the world. And from that information alone, we can extract really private information. It goes much deeper than that. Clearly, there were some not so recent stories. There was one story where Facebook somehow suggested that someone who had no clue that they were related to someone else through, you know, I don't know, some adoption and some crazy stuff in the middle, figured out that these two people were related and said, hey, be friends. Or in another case, there were people who were going to see a therapist and Facebook said, hey, why don't you all become friends? And there was no other connection between these people except they all went to the same therapist. That's a pretty easy idea of what they, how they figured that out. I mean, I'm sure they all had the same GPS locations at this therapist's office once a week. And so Facebook assumed, I don't know, they're all going to the same bar, so they might as well be friends. So, you know, from GPS information on its own, we can find lots of really sort of private information. And even when we try to anonymize information, even when these large corporations try to anonymize information, the private information often still leaks out. So any of you watch, who uses Netflix? Who's a Netflix person? You're all Netflix people, Hulu, Disney Plus, any Disney Plus people? Mandalorians? No? Disney Plus is going to be bigger than Netflix, they say. I guess because of the Mandalorian and because Netflix there's nothing there to watch at this point. Just Office reruns. And so I've been a long time fan of Netflix. I mean, I was probably 2008, 2009, I'd sign up for Netflix. This is when they were still sending out the red envelopes with the DVDs. You guys know what DVDs are, right? Those are those shiny discs. You throw them at people. So Netflix was still sending out DVDs, and there was a website. This wasn't pre-web, but there was a website, and the website essentially said, if you watch this movie, you want to watch this movie. Like something like this, right? Because you watched A Bug's Life, you want to watch The Human Centipede. They're essentially the same movie. But Netflix, seeing this, wanted to figure out if they could create a better algorithm, right? They want you to watch more movies. That's why, by the way, everyone recognizes that Netflix cuts out after the fourth season of everything. Four seasons on Netflix and then you're dead, because Netflix wants to bring in more people, and after four seasons, it's not bringing in new subscribers. They always want to bring in new shows to bring in new subscribers. After four seasons, they're not making money for Netflix anymore. So Netflix wants to optimize their algorithm, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And so they say, how about $1 million bounty? We're going to send out a data set of anonymized information. So no one's going to know that I watched A Bug's Life and then I watched A Human Centipede. So I don't know what they think about me. So we're going to anonymize the data. We're going to send it out to the world, and we're going to, $1 million bounty if you can come up with a better algorithm with this anonymous data of, I watched this, I gave it 5 stars. I watched this, I gave it 3 stars. And how can I figure out, that sort of information? So there was, I think, a group in Texas that said, hey, big data. What's another website with people's personal information, such as their name, where there's the exact same data set that we can cross-reference with the Netflix data set and de-anonymize everyone on Netflix and destroy whatever semblance of privacy they thought they had? So there was a group in Texas, again, they de-anonymized the Netflix database by using IMDb, another database where people watch movies and they rate the movies. And so that was a mess. This is all sort of old stories. Let's talk about some of the new privacy stories in the media. So I don't know if you guys, right? Drones are always on the news, right? People are always fearful that drones are flying overhead and collecting our information. Pandemic contact tracing. Anyone been sort of on the receiving end of pandemic contact tracing, where you get a call from the men in black who say, I'm sorry, time to go into quarantine? It's happened to me a number of times, more times than I'd like to admit to, but really a lot of times. And so this is, ostensibly GPS based, but also it can also, at least where I live, they can track you unrelated to your GPS. So people started, going on to airplane mode and trying to hide their GPS and leaving their phone at home, and they still got caught up in this contact tracing. And the real question is, as with all things associated with the pandemic, is what sort of privacy implications are there with this infrastructure once the pandemic is over, right? So the government, let's say they're collecting data from us on our cell phones, right? Ostensibly to keep track of who's giving who the virus. But now the virus is over, everyone has their shot. By the way, I got my 2. I've got 2 from Pfizer. It's in there, or it's probably everywhere now. But I've had it now for like a month and a half. You guys are slow. So what happens now when we have this technology and there's no more need for it? The government will repurpose it. Same thing, another privacy implication is at the border, right? Where you have to take either a PCR test to assess whether or not you have the virus, or one of these rapid tests. Like, what's to stop them from repurposing that to find out, oh, we'd rather not have anyone who has Huntington's disease coming into the country, so we're going to test everyone for that. Or we'd rather not have anyone who has, a predisposition to Alzheimer's. So anyone who's carrying a mutation in ApoE4, sorry, you're not coming in today. So you can imagine the government repurposing this technology that it's using for the pandemic for other sorts of very intrusive, very privacy informing uses. So this is something to be considerate of.
I would argue that that's already happening.
Is it already happening?
Yeah, like if I can give an example of this, is I would say the COVID case was a repurposing of something that's already happening, in the sense that if you were to get a US visa of any sorts from any international country at this point, you need to get through a wide variety of health checks, ranging from TB to HIV to HPV. And if you do disqualify on some of them, or on a couple of them, you can potentially get your visa rejected.
Wow.
So I would say that the COVID screening is a more massive form of something that's already been happening. I'm sure it can get worse in the scenarios that you're saying, but I would say that it's already there.
But now it becomes more insidious, right? Because there are a number of countries where you don't need a visa to get into the country. I mean, I'm Canadian. I don't need I'm also American. I admit to both. I hate myself, right? I think that's how it works if you're Canadian and American. Um, it's like I went to Berkeley and then I went to Stanford. I don't know who to root for. But this is the same thing with, you know, there are many countries where you don't need a visa to get in and they can still test you at the border. So this becomes increasingly problematic. This is related to this idea of green passports. You guys have green passports? No? So green passports is this emerging idea that, anyone see the movie Contagion? Yeah? So I spoke to Scott Burns a couple weeks ago, a couple months ago, whatever, time doesn't exist anymore. But I spoke to Scott Burns, who wrote the movie, and he said this is something he's been thinking about. It's like been going on in his mind, and it's incredible the sort of stuff he came up with. But one of the interesting ideas that he came up with was, I don't know if you remember, but when Matt Damon, I don't know who he was playing, but whoever Matt Damon was playing, and he wants to go buy a pink dress for his daughter for her prom, right? He has to show a, well, this is a watch, but he has to show like you're going into a concert, or you're going into a water park. He has to show that he is vaccinated. And so this exists now in reality. I have a green passport, which says that I've been vaccinated and I can go into certain places. I can go into gyms. I can go into restaurants. I can talk to people without my mask on, supposedly. So this is another sort of privacy invasion thing, especially if perhaps you do not have a vaccine for whatever reason. You're immune compromised and you can't get a vaccine. I don't know why you wouldn't have a vaccine. Let's say, you know, and that sort of discloses private information about you. You're an anti-vaxxer. That's also, I mean, I think they like to shout from the rooftops. But if you're an anti-vaxxer and you don't want the people to know, then, you know, this sort of is a privacy issue as well. Another issue that's also coming up in the news a lot is law enforcement and facial recognition technology. So there was a case that happened in Detroit a couple months ago where some guy who was black, who was you know, arrested on his front lawn in front of his children for some robbery. That was all based on a really bad image that was run through some facial recognition algorithm, and he was held in jail for like 30 hours. So this is this is an emerging issue, whether or not we're constantly under surveillance, where our privacy is essentially gone because you know, the facial recognition technology is always looking at us. You know, there's this feeling that it's always looking at us. By the way, there is a Russian app. I don't know if you're familiar with it. That's another version of this where, do you guys, anyone see the Black Mirror episode, White Christmas? Right, starring John Hamm. Great episode. So in White Christmas, the episode, John Hamm he plays a guy who moonlights as a advisor for those who cannot date or those who are socially inept. And they use facial recognition technology to figure out who someone is and then look at their Facebook profile. There is a Russian app today that you can get that you're sitting in a restaurant, you want to know who that person is on the other side because you want to ask them out or you want to know something about them, take a picture. The Russian app will pull up whatever Facebook profile is available and you will know who they are. So facial recognition technology is so insidious, I think, that at one point Microsoft and Amazon said that we're not going to do it anymore. But of course, we all use facial recognition technology on a daily basis, right? Anyone here use facial recognition technology? When you look at your phone and it turns on for you, that's facial recognition technology, right? So we're all using this technology, and this gets to the idea unrelated to privacy, but somehow related to privacy, is that can technology be both good and bad? Is technology ethically neutral? But we're not going to get into that. And of course, the most recent issue that came up was WhatsApp, who had a new privacy policy. Right when they got bought out by Facebook, they promised they wouldn't join the dark side. And then Facebook said, well, we broke the promise, and now WhatsApp's going to give all your information to Facebook. And so that was sort of this other privacy issue. So drilling down, right? So there was this thing. This is my passport. It looks really nice. So right, there are privacy issues associated with green passports. There's another issue that just came up in the area of privacy. is Apple. Apple is now no longer, well, is now informing you, or they want to now inform you that various apps are going to be using your data and sharing it. Facebook is very much against this, and then Facebook said, okay, we're for it. And then Facebook decided that they're going to have their own pop-up. And again, this is this idea that our private information is being shared with all these sorts of apps all over the internet. Google is doing the same thing. And so because of all this, you know, there are new laws. There are new laws in the book. So there is an effort to make a national law in the US. It will die, guaranteed. But there is an effort to make a national law in the US to provide some sort of privacy, national consumer data privacy legislation along the lines of what goes on in Europe. It won't happen. I think there's only one sponsor of the bill. Another area that's in the news that I think might be relevant, China is not going to let Teslas in because it's spying on people. So, you know, we've talked a lot about privacy here. And I think what I have done is I failed to say what is privacy. This is something we want to protect. This is something that we're all scared of. This is something that big data somehow destroys. But what is privacy that we want to protect it? So anyone can write in the chat what they think privacy is. But I think, I mean, my favorite definition about it is something that goes along sort of this sort of idea. So privacy isn't, you know, keeping information, let's say Mark, right? I don't think he's listening in. I'm sure he's busy doing something. But let's say privacy is, I don't want Mark to know that I don't like pink shirts because I see he's wearing a pink shirt here, right? So privacy isn't not only the absence of not letting Mark know that information about me, but it's also this idea that I have the right to tell the world who I am. And if someone invades my privacy, they are essentially circumventing me and saying, I'm going to tell you who I think he is. No, that's my right. And, you know, so that's actually a really interesting sort of concept, because if that is what privacy means, this idea that I have the right to control how the world sees me, first of all, it makes a lot of sense in today's day and age when there's, you know, there's a growing trans community, and there's people who want to control how they are spoken about in the world. They want to control their pronouns, right? That sort of stems from this whole sort of privacy world. But what it also means, and you know, to some degree, I don't know if this is accounted for in various privacy laws, is that we all know, I don't know if you guys have done this, but you can go into your Google account and you can go into your Facebook account, or I don't know what you kids are doing these days. I don't know, Snapchat, no one's using Snapchat, Twitter or TikTok or whatever the crazy people are doing these days. You can go into your account and you can say, how do you view me? What do you think I am? Who do you think I am? And the reality is that you could argue, you can make the legal argument that by Google creating a persona of me that does not match my persona, they are in essence violating my privacy. They're sharing this persona with all their advertisers. But by doing so, that's a violation of my privacy, because arguably only I have the right to tell the world who I am. If someone else tells the world who I am, that is an invasion of privacy. Simplistically, right? If I was gay and in the closet, which I'm not, but let's say I was gay and in the closet and someone outed me, that would be an invasion of my privacy, because that is up to me to tell the world that information, not up to the person who outed me. Other sort of ideas along the line, sort of penumbra, sort of tangential ideas of privacy relate to the control over your personal information, even simply the right to be left alone. You know, that's sort of a physical privacy, more sort of a digital privacy, the right to limit access to me, the right for me to say, you know, you can only go this far, you can't come into my house is my private domain, you can't come into my Facebook account, you know, I have some aspects of my Facebook account that are private, so this is also limited access to me. This idea of intimacy, only some people can know me intimately. This idea of personhood, which I just described, and of course, the simple idea of secrecy. I have a secret about me, but you disclosing it, you are in a violation of my privacy. And of course, there are different classes of privacy. So we can think about information privacy, bodily privacy. So bodily privacy would relate to sort of genetic testing. So there's a law on the books now, or no, that's not on the books. There's a law that they're trying to get on the books relates to genetic testing and what information can be disclosed from these genetic testing companies. Relates to territorial privacy. So you can't come into my house. And communication privacy. You can't read my email. You can't read my physical mail. So speaking about sort of the legal aspects of privacy, I think it's also, privacy hasn't been around for that long legally. We all recognize that, the fact that, we all live in cities is a function of the Industrial Revolution. And prior to that, we were all sort of out in our villages, living our very quiet lives with, again, one or two people, busybodies who knew everyone, the town snitch or whatever, but most people had their private lives. So this whole legal concept of privacy is relatively new. One of the earliest cases happened in the United Kingdom, where you had Prince Albert and Queen Vic. They have their own museum now. You can go, lots of cool stuff there. They, for some reason, drew pictures. That was their thing. And someone wanted to publish their pictures. And so Prince Albert sued. And the courts found that that there should be, there should be a principle of protecting property that also includes the sheltering of privacy and seclusion of thoughts and sentiments committed to writing and desired by the author to remain not generally known. So again, this is a very sort of early idea of privacy. This is the king, or so not the king, well, the prince consort. This guy was considerably younger than Philip, but died before Philip, and maybe not before he was born. I mean, Prince Philip is really old. And Queen Victoria. So we had the king and the queen, well, the prince and the queen demanding privacy. In the US, it started a little later. So we had cameras. I remember when cameras first came out on cell phones. Anyone remember that year? I don't know. It was like, I want to say it started becoming really popular in 2001, 2002. And I, for the life of me, couldn't understand why anyone would put a camera on their cell phone. That didn't make any sense to me. But I got one anyways. And it made sense to me when I got into an accident. And I took pictures of the accident. So then it really made sense. But when cameras earlier came out, actually when cameras came out on cell phones, I don't know if you guys remember this, maybe some of you weren't even born. I'm sure you were all born. They came out with this sort of rules in gyms and things like that, that if you had a cell phone with a camera on it, you couldn't bring it into the locker room, because clearly the only purpose of having a camera on your phone was to take pictures of people in the locker room. And so cameras were always associated with this sort of destruction of privacy. And in fact, even the old-timey cameras sort of instigated this whole sort of world of privacy in the United States. So there was a Harvard Law Review article written in, I'm going to say 1890, because that's what it says on the page, by these two guys, nobodies really, Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis. I don't think they amounted to much. And they essentially came out saying that there is an idea of privacy and the law should protect us. And it's evolved somewhat from them. And so we have the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, Article 12, sort of talks about this idea of privacy. By the way, the US Constitution has nothing about privacy. Whether or not you want to fit it into any one of the amendments, it's something else. And for the most part, people ignored this, right? This wasn't really relevant until, at least for the most of us, this wasn't really relevant until we got to the internet, the age of the internet. And, right, according to Bruce Schneier, surveillance is a business model of the internet. We all know that now. It wasn't so obvious a couple years ago, but we all now experience what it means to lose our privacy, where before it was unlikely that we would lose our privacy to the degree that we're giving it up now. Jonathan Zittrain, I don't know where he is now. Where is he? Is he at Harvard? Cambridge? He used to be at Oxford a long time ago. Anyways, Jonathan Zittrain famously said, or quoted someone as saying, right, if something online is free, you're not the customer, you're the product, right? So suddenly the growth of the internet resulted in a total loss of privacy because our data, our big data, which again you just learned about, is now the source of information and collected to both learn what we disclose, but also learn about what we do not disclose. And perhaps, no picture better sums up what the internet has done to privacy than this picture of Zuck in his office, right? Celebrating, I don't know, his purchase of Instagram or whatever he was celebrating. But clearly if you zoom in on his computer, you will notice he's taped over his camera, he's taped over his microphone because he knows that they're listening in. And who knows better than him that they're listening in? So this is whether or not they admit to listening in is another thing. WhatsApp just got in trouble, I think, for admitting to listening in. So yeah, they're listening in. And so this is today's reality. We have essentially no privacy. And it's not only the internet that kills our privacy. I don't know if you guys travel, if you go over bridges or go on toll roads, but like E-ZPass, maybe not be tracking us. It's unclear. They kind of say they're not, but they are, but who knows? There have been cases where they've used E-ZPass to assess whether or not someone, I don't know if maybe they used it with permission at that time to assess whether or not someone could have murdered someone else. They could clearly use it to decide whether or not we've been speeding, right? If you go from toll to toll a little too quickly, then you've probably been speeding or going through a wormhole, whichever one is more likely. And even our kids, not only do they suffer from lack of privacy from, let's say, the government and from social media, but you can do this to your kids if you want to. You can stick a little device in their car and track them. I'd do it if I could. Why not? I track their phones. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Are we recording? No. Okay. Well, they'll never watch it. Okay. There's also privacy not only on the privacy issues, not only in this whole sphere, but even the sphere where I operate in the area of law. There's some really interesting privacy issues. So we all watch police procedural shows, right? Law and Order. It's still on, right? SVU is still on, I think, isn't it? Who knows? Whatever, it's still around. So we all know there's privacy built into the law. So there's all these privileges: spousal privilege, attorney-client privilege, physician-patient privilege, clergy communicant privilege. So there's some of them have more value than others. The most famous one is clearly attorney-client privilege. And here's an interesting aspect, which will get us into the next issue, which is in the area of attorney-client privilege. The internet has both created a problem and kind of solved it. So anyone traveled recently? Anyone fly somewhere? Get up and close and personal with someone from the TSA? No? The New York Bar Association has essentially said that if you are an attorney and you are traveling through a U.S. border, you are potentially in an ethical violation by taking your computer with you, because they can force you to unlock your computer. And by forcing you to unlock your computer, they can disclose emails and documents relating to attorney-client privilege, and privilege will be destroyed by the TSA. And so they suggest that if you're going through any US border, you should take a burner phone or something like that, like pretend you're a spy. Of course, technology has also solved this problem, which is simply put everything on your Google Drive and don't leave anything on your hard drive. And then all your data is ostensibly safe from the TSA. So that's law. We should talk a little bit about genetic privacy. So genetics. Ought there be genetic privacy? We talked about legal privacy. We talked about privacy online. Is there a concept of genetic privacy, right? So do we say that privacy in genetics is more valuable because there's a concept of genetic exceptionalism, which is everything associated with genes is somehow extra special, or not? Perhaps for the most part, most of our genetic information is still uninterpretable, like I have over here. I don't know if you guys remember this. When science came out with the human genome, they put out someone's genome, and they did something with it. It's a nice piece of art. right? But for the most part, if you sequence an entire human genome, there's a lot of information that you would have, but a lot of it would not be, you wouldn't be able to extract any meaningful information from that. Of course, also in the area of genetics, when you test, when you provide information, it discloses not only your information, it also discloses information about you and your loved ones, if your loved ones happen to be related to you. And so that's a disclosure as well. So it's not only your personal information that comes into play in genetics, other people's information as well. Of course, you may be like some important professors worldwide who would say, well, you know, I have Sherlock Holmes, right? There's a new Sherlock Holmes show on where Sherlock is like a bad guy, or Watson's a bad guy. I don't know. I heard about murmurs about this. But right, we don't have a Moriarty. We don't have an arch enemy that's out to get us. And so some people say, so what? Your genetic information, no one really cares. Who's going to actually go look at it? That said, there's a lot of federal regulation that protects genetic and genetic related information. HIPAA, we're all familiar with. If anyone works in a lab in Yale, then you all have to sign some HIPAA disclosures. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, has some sort of rules in there. I think even Americans with Disabilities Act, but don't quote me on that, even though this is all being quoted. And my favorite is GINA. So GINA is Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act, essentially saying that neither your employer nor your health insurance provider, if I'm correct, can have access to your genetic information. I'll skip a bit, which results in a great case, sort of an abuse of this technology, but it's a fun case nonetheless. So this is an article in Nature discussing what was known as the devious defecator. What is a devious defecator? So again, GINA says that your employer cannot demand your genetic information from you because that is private information. Of course, they have surreptitious ways to get around that. You know, they do like health and wellness programs and things like that, and there are other ways to get around it. But, oh, I should put in this disclosure since we're being recorded. While I am a U.S. attorney or a California attorney, none of the information that I am providing here should be in any way perceived to be in any way legal advice in any way. I am not giving any advice to anyone here. Nothing I'm saying has any relevance to the actual, well, it kind of does. I'm not going to say that. But yeah, this isn't legal advice. Okay. Back to the defecator case. So there is an employer who is by law not allowed to request genetic information from her employee. Now, it turns out that they run some sort of warehouse related to some food, and I may be getting the facts of the case not exact, but essentially every morning there is a nice present, warm present waiting in the middle of the floor of this warehouse. As you can tell from the name of the case, the devious defecator, it's clear what that warm present is. I don't want to get into any more details. Now, I don't know how anyone here have a dog. So there are services that what they do is that they, you know, if they find a treat left over by a dog, they can genetically test that and then figure out who the dog was or who owns the dog. And so this employee said, hey, if we can do it with dogs, we can do it with people. So she extracted whatever DNA information she could get from this present that she receives. And she said, well, I happen to know that there are two pranksters who happen to work in this warehouse. I'm going to assume that it's them, even though they deny it. And so I'm going to test what they've left. And then I'm going to demand their genetic information. And if they deny it, or if they don't give it to me, whatever, there will be consequences. And so she demanded that she be able to sequence them. I assume it's like a CODIS test, which is what it's the standard FBI thing where they look at 20 loci across the human genome. It doesn't really provide any information. It only, actually, this is a good segue. I'm going to get lost here. But this is an important distinction in genetics, and that is when the police sequence us and they put us into what's known as a CODIS database, which is the FBI's national database or related to genetic information. We can make a distinction between collecting descriptive information and collecting identifying information. So for example, if anyone has a driver's license, you will know that there is an ID number on your driver's license. That ID number in no way describes you. It only identifies you. Same thing with this CODIS data. It's genetic information that only identifies you, but it's clearly been designed to not in any way describe you. There was one suggestion that at one point after the first ENCODE papers came out, that maybe there was some correlation between one loci and something to do with mental health, but that's been debunked. So back to the devious defecator. So this lady collects, the boss lady, that's her real name, Mrs. Boss Lady collects data from the defecation and from the individuals, and she assesses, and turns out she was wrong. It wasn't these guys. They end up suing her under the Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act that says that an employer is not allowed to demand genetic information. Ostensibly, the law was designed so you can't demand information to know that I'm going to become sick in 5 years and become a liability on the company. But she uses it for another purpose, and she loses in court to the tune of millions of dollars that she has to pay to these guys who will never work in a warehouse again. Now, GINA is a national law. It's a relatively weak law. There's really no teeth to it for the most part. And so more recently in, I'm going to say California, because it's signed by Gavin Newsom, and that's the seal of the great state of California. California decided they were going to set up a similar law called JIPA, which is the, I forget what it stands for, but it should say here on the letter. I don't know. But whatever, Gavin Newsom, who is on his way out at this point because he's been eating too many times at the French Laundry during the pandemic, right? We're all familiar with Gavin Newsom's sins. So he doesn't sign this law. And so right now, there's really one law, GINA. GINA took a long time. Representative Slaughter took 10 years to get this law passed, and it's unlikely, given the power of the insurance companies in this country, to have it pass, a similar law passed again. So that's GINA, and that's genetics, which gets us into the other more important G starting law, GDPR, the General Data Protection regulation, which came into effect in 2018, has a whole bunch of compliance obligations, creates requirements if there's a data breach that you have to disclose that information, requires all this information with regard to personal data, and also requires that everyone have a data protection officer in their thing. GDPR makes this fake sort of distinction between personal data and non-personal data, which I argued at the beginning of the class doesn't really exist, but they have these sorts of ideas of what is and what is not personal data. GDPR has all these obligations on companies that collect data. So we've all heard of the right to be forgotten, which was created by a guy who at this point will never be forgotten because his name is all over all the case law with regard to the right to be forgotten, right? It's called the Barbara, everyone's familiar with the Barbara Streisand effect? Yes? Those who don't know, Barbara Streisand effect relates to an internet phenomenon that the more attention you, the more you try to evade attention, the more attention will be shone on you. So the Barbara Streisand effect comes from the story where Barbara Streisand had a beautiful home in Malibu, I assume, overlooking the beach on a cliff, and the government of California was taking pictures of the cliffside, and Barbara Streisand, and making them publicly available for surveys regarding to cliff erosion. That's a real thing, I guess. And so Barbara Streisand found out about the fact that this is pre-Google, that they're taking pictures of her home while they're taking pictures of the cliff. And she demanded that these not be released to the public, because why should they be able to see a overview shot of her home? Now, before Barbara Streisand made a stink about this, only 2 people had ever looked at these pictures, her and her attorney. And when it was all said and done, thousands of people had downloaded the images related to Barbara Streisand, which at the end of the day means, the Barbara Streisand effect. Look it up. It's a lot of fun. Back to GDPR. So GDPR grants you the person from whom the data is collected all these sorts of rights. The right to be forgotten, the right to have your data corrected, the right to port your data to somewhere else, the right to access your data, the right to retract consent, the right to have explicit consent required, which gets to like a weird thing in the area of privacy law, and that is who actually owns your data. So I don't know, I asked you guys already if anyone actually owns a car, and no one here admitted to it. But if you owned a car, and when you went to the dealership and the dealer said, yes, I'm selling you this car, but I need it on Wednesdays, and you have to wash it only at this car wash. And, right, there's still a car wash next to Stop and Shop across from the parking lot. Is that still there? Across from Edge of the Woods? Is that still there? I haven't been there in a long time. Right? This is the gas you have to use, and this is the gas station you have to go to, right? You would argue that I don't own the car. I don't have full ownership of the car because you are putting all these requirements on me. And so you could also argue, and this is a long-standing issue in the area of privacy laws, who owns my data? Is it me, who I retain all these rights to my data, or is it Google, who is collecting my data? So it's unclear. But these privacy rights that GDPR grants to you are also somewhat inane, in that they create huge obligations on all these companies that collect data, which make it very hard for startups to be in compliance. And to give you an example, there is a website that you can go to, I think it's still available, called Chip Your Enemy's GDPR. Right? Your enemy looks like he's upset. And why is that the case? Because GDPR has compliance regulations, essentially that says to Google, you can write a letter to Google every month saying, Google, tell me what you have on me. And Google has to comply. And if they don't comply, there are huge fines, huge fines. So GDPR, while it ostensibly protects the privacy of individuals, also creates a huge headache for those companies that want to use that data, which hurts innovation to some degree because it prevents startups from going into this space because, again, the requirements that GDPR creates are onerous. Now, one of these requirements that GDPR requires is what's known as privacy by design. Anyone here Canadian? No? Marcus' family is Canadian. Anyone here have nephews, nieces, little kids in your lives? Do you guys know the song Baby Beluga? No? Baby Beluga is a song written by a guy named Rafi Kevorkian, who is of Egyptian and Azerbaijani descent. He's a great children's singer. Baby Beluga is his signature song. Look it up. But Rafi actually has a equally impressive sister. I don't know her name though. I know his name because he goes by Rafi, R-A-F-F-I. Anne, her name is Anne Kevorkian, who is Canadian, like her brother, who created this concept of what's known as privacy by design, this really crazy thing that essentially says that privacy is valuable. And so companies that develop, at least in Canada at this point, and also in Europe, if they develop new technology, the technology has to be developed with privacy inherent in the design. So a great example would be your cell phone. Who has a cell phone? Anyone have a cell phone? You guys have cell phones in New Haven? You never know. So how many of you encrypt your data on your cell phone? Nobody, right? You know you can encrypt your data, right? So that when the FBI comes for you, they can't access it and Apple's not going to help them. You all know these stories. Okay, well, you can encrypt the data on your phone. Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. But I'm not, again, this isn't legal advice. But if you were to encrypt your data on your phone, your data privacy would be better protected. Now, something that is privacy by design would encrypt your data by default. Your phones do not encrypt your data by default for a whole host of reasons. And so that is what would be known as not privacy by design. You know, another example would be the web camera that we're all using to look at each other right now, right? They are not developed with your privacy in mind. You know, most of them don't have shutters. Most of them can be easily hacked. as was the case a couple years ago when Netflix went down because all these phones, all these cameras were hacked, and they did a denial of service attack against some central hub, and that killed Netflix for a while. Everyone was really sad. So this is this idea of privacy by design, developed by Anne Kevorkian, the sister of Rafi Kevorkian, famous singer. So privacy by design, sort of, well, we'll skip ethics by design. I don't want to go into these boring details, but California has a law, CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, was sort of GDPR-like, developed in 2018, has a lot of same sort of rules that GDPR has: the right to know what personal information is collected, the right to delete personal information, the right to opt out of sale of personal information, the right of not being discriminated against if you ask for this information. And more recently, in the last election, California, which is a direct democracy, for good or for bad, enacted what's known as Prop 24. Prop 24 expanded the law to even greater lengths. And one of the interesting things that they added to this idea was that sensitive information now includes GPS information, among other things that it required. And California also, while we're talking about California, also created a Privacy Protection Agency board, which is also really cool. So that's California. Other states in the nation also have privacy laws. So Illinois has one that's often sort of abused. Anyone been to Six Flags recently? So Illinois has a privacy law related to collection of biometric information. And so there was a case where, I don't know, some mother was upset that to get her son's season pass at Six Flags in Illinois, her son had to provide his fingerprint, and she found that that was a violation of the Illinois biometric privacy law. You cannot collect private biometric information without the necessary sort of permissions and necessary sort of consent. And this has been a bane on numerous sort of large corporations, to the extent that not everything that you can get through, not all the Google services that you can get through Google are actually available in Illinois because they don't want to be sued under this law. Same thing with Facebook. This is a very broadly applied law. Virginia actually just passed the nation's newest privacy law, literally weeks ago. This is the third consumer privacy law, I think, in the country. And again, it's similar to the laws passed by California, not similar at all to Illinois. Texas was thinking about one. I don't know what happened to that. I think it probably died. Virginia, what's interesting about the Virginia privacy law, anyone seen the movie Minority Report? You know, when Tom Cruise, he's walking through the mall and he gets all this directed advertising. So I guess they're forward-looking, under Virginia privacy law, you can opt out of that. You can also opt out of Facebook doing the same sort of thing, right? Whenever we go, anyone buy anything recently and then have Facebook come after you with all these ads? Like, I already bought it. Why are you still sending me all these ads for the same sort of thing that I just bought forevermore? So you can opt out of that under the new Virginia privacy law. So other states are working on it. So like New York, Maryland, 2 Marylands. Oh, that's a bad copy paste. Tennessee. An interesting issue is if your yes, biometrics can be applied to facial recognition technology. Same sort of thing. An interesting case that sort of created much of this mess is this idea of, if my privacy is being invaded, have I physically actually been harmed, right? In the United States, again, this is not legal advice. I haven't practiced law in way too long at this point. But you need a case, what's known as a case in controversy, which means that, there has to be a fight. There has to be someone who stands to win something and someone who stands to lose something. So there was a really cool case way back when. There's a company called Spokeo, rhymes with Tokyo. That's how they used to sell it. And Spokeo, this is what their website looked like circa 2006. This is a great story. Only an American story. So there was a guy, and his data was collected by Spokeo. Spokeo is like one of those, you know, when you want to look up an old flame online and you find a website that has their information, but it's kind of blacked out, and only if you pay them, they'll give you the information that's probably out of date anyways. That sort of thing. That's what Spokeo is, or was, or is. So Spokeo collected this information. And you can see on this site, like, you know, Bebo doesn't exist anymore. Anyone remember Bebo? Bebo was a social media platform that sent messages to the aliens in outer space. By the way, anyone read that article recently in Scientific American saying that Oumuamua was not alien, but it was like from a Pluto-like planet that just came out? No, you guys aren't following this? Okay. Dig no longer exists. Friendster doesn't exist. MySpace is still there. Wow. Flickr is gone, I think. Wow, all this stuff is gone. Okay. Anyway, Spokeo would go through the internet and collect information about people. And in this one incident, Spokeo collected information and disclosed that this guy, random guy, was, you know, wealthy, had a beautiful family, a beautiful wife, a home, a car, a boat, you know, everything that any American could want, right? The American dream. Turns out this guy was a deadbeat. He had no family. He was divorced. He was miserable. He had nothing. And he sued Spokeo for sort of like an invasion of privacy sort of thing, saying that you've told the world something about me that isn't true. And this is not how I want to be presented to the world. He sued Spokeo. This went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. These people are dead as well, some of them, unfortunately. And nothing really happened in the Supreme Court, but they basically said that he has an injury, or he should have or you should consider that he potentially has an injury. And this, you know, essentially means that when you collect data on someone and you invade their privacy, even though there isn't any actual harm, the mere fact that you collect information about someone could be perceived as being a harm. Fine. Last thing, I'm out of time. I can't get to this. I was going to talk about this cool thing.
Well, Deb, you can go on for a minute or two more if you want to go on for a minute or two. That's fine. You can go for 5 more minutes if you need to.
Okay, I'll run through this really quick. So there was this thing that I was thinking about. I don't know if you guys think about this, but it's always bothered me that we make this distinction between somatic gene editing and germline gene editing. Right, this is the whole brouhaha with the twins that were, you know, with the CCR5 gene in China, is that this was germline editing and not somatic cell editing. This always sort of bothered me, and I never really understood why this was a distinction that we made, because whenever two people decide to have a child together, they're essentially doing germline editing, right? Whenever someone decides to smoke or live in a polluted environment and his sperm gets messed up because of that, he's essentially doing germline editing. But for some reason, you know, doing it via CRISPR is problematic, doing it via smoking, not so problematic. So I was thinking about this for a while. And then I was also thinking about all these stories that I kept on hearing with all these sorts of doctors that were, you know, and this happens like every month. Every month there's a doctor who's having 100 kids, like that Vince Vaughn movie, Delivery Man. Anyone see that? I don't think it was worth seeing. I didn't see it. I assume it's not worth seeing because it has Vince Vaughn in it. No offense to Vince Vaughn lovers. If anyone's related to Vince Vaughn, I did not intend to offend anyone. But I was thinking, like, why not, if I am a evil fertility doctor, why don't I just manipulate those loci in my genome that are used to identify me as a parent, such that in my sperm, such that, you know, I won't be caught fathering hundreds of children. And clearly the fear is that they're going to come back and they want me to pay for their college education. And that's associated with this other idea in the sperm sort of donation world, which is that sperm donors no longer, in the age of 23andMe, sperm donors no longer have any semblance of privacy. right? There's always someone digging up information and finding out who the sperm donor is. And so that got me thinking, back to this idea of somatic gene editing versus germline gene editing. Why don't, what is so wrong about editing my sperm such that I don't make any long-term changes to humanity, but I do make, changes to just, again, these loci that don't in any way affect, they're in what used to be known as a junk DNA, but that's not PC anymore. We can't call it junk DNA because that's offensive. Whatever regions that is, right? Non-coding regions of DNA. So skip ahead. And so, like I spoke to before, this whole idea of privacy actually leaks into this area of genetics, right? When we were talking about the General Data Protection Regulation and all the rules and regulations and all the onerous obligations that they create on the data collectors, and I essentially said, I question who actually owns your data? Who owns this really private information? Is it you or is it data collector? And I wanted to say, to some degree, perhaps, we can extract from this privacy law a really interesting idea with regard to genetics. And that is, there is a distinction between ownership of data versus custody of data. Google has custody over my data, which gives them obligations vis-a-vis my data, vis-a-vis me. That's a lot of vis-a-vis, that's 4 of them. 4 visas and 2 ahs. But so that creates a semblance of custody. And I think, this idea that I sort of extracted with regard to privacy and data privacy is that those people have they don't own my data, and so they don't have any obligations because of their ownership of my data vis-a-vis my privacy. That's a 5th. But they have obligations to me because they have custody of my data, not actually ownership of my data. And so that really got me thinking, back to this other idea of, this sort of distinction between somatic cell genetic engineering versus germline gene engineering. And that is, again, this distinction maybe perhaps with regard to ownership and custody of the genome. We could argue that we are against germline editing because we don't actually have ownership of the genome. We own our own genetic information. We have privacy rights in our own genetic information, but we are merely custodians over the entirety of the human genome. And thus, we can't edit the germline, or we find it unethical to edit the germline because we are just custodians over the germline. But we can edit the somatic cells because that we actually have ownership over. So that's, that's sort of an interesting sort of idea that I extracted from privacy law and sort of applied to this thing that's always bothered me in the area of genetic information. So I'm going to leave it at that. I've already gone over time. People have already left. That is upsetting, but I'm done. Any questions? I don't know if that's a hand or a clap, so I'm going to go for a clap.
Well, no, this is a great good job, Dov. Any questions from anyone?
I've totally bored them, Mark.
No. I think it was great. I think it was very good. Unfortunately, I think in this virtual format, it's all muted in some strange muted way in the virtual world where we are. But no, I think it was great. Any questions from anyone?
There's a question in the chat. Rachel asked,
I answered that already. Yes, the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a quick question. I actually asked this to one of the other speakers. I'm curious to how you think the corporate ownership of modern genetic testing companies, for example, Blackstone bought out huge stakes in 23andMe, is going to influence the landscape of genetic privacy.
Wow. So, sorry, hold on. 23andMe was never interested in genetic privacy, right? They were from the outset interested in selling their information, and they made that very well known. And not only did they make it very well known, but people still had the gall when they made this $300 million deal, not with Blackstone, but with a pharmaceutical company, I think Glaxo, maybe somebody, that they said we deserve some sort of right to some of the profits because it's our data. 23andMe didn't do that. Now, I think that 23andMe has had some run-ins with the law in the past with the FDA. So I think they're particularly at this point risk averse. But nobody wants to be on the receiving end of any sort of lawsuits or any sort of concerns with regard to privacy, because it could be the kiss of death, right? 23andMe is not the only fish in the sea. There's other sort of companies, and so that's the same reason why, I don't know, how many of you have an Alexa, right? Why there was a case in Arizona way back when, where someone was listening to, I don't know, some music on Alexa, and then he was murdered, or he murdered someone else, and then the police demanded from Amazon that they disclose all the information, and Amazon said no. Alexa has the right, First Amendment right of free speech. She has the right to not disclose information, and so we are not going to disclose information. Amazon doesn't care whether or not Alexa has rights or not. Amazon knows full well that if they disclose information from Alexa, people are going to stop using the technology, because again, they say the weirdest things to Alexa and they don't want people to know what they're saying. And so I think the same sort of idea goes with every modern corporation at this point, which is no one wants to be known as a corporation that shares your data, particularly genetic information. So for example, I don't know if you guys remember, like 2 years ago, the Golden State Killer was caught based on, sort of quasi, these sort of sleuthing by, I don't know, quasi amateurs. And after that came out, a number of sites said, you know what, we're not making this data public anymore, because people complained. People are upset when their genetic information gets shared. And so I think 23andMe knows full well that, maybe share the data in aggregate, maybe share the data in some way that really anonymizes the data. But I think 23andMe is smart enough not to in any way disclose your privacy purposefully. That was a long-winded way of saying no.
I have a question, Dov.
Sure.
Which is, when I think you talked very effectively about how from sort of the internet, we reached to a point where sort of our privacy was completely manipulated. And no one quite knew when the internet was coming forward that this is going to happen. With sort of genomic data, we kind of have that hindsight that sort of what big data can really do. But do you see any other scope in which this could really sort of be leveraged, sort of the big data of genomics, or sort of in general biology be leveraged in very negative formats? Other than the ones that we discussed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's the CODIS database, right? There's a whole database of millions of people's genetic information that currently has no sort of any sort of actionable information associated with it. But who knows? Maybe in 20 years we'll know that all this data that we've been collecting now has very sort of relevant information to whether or not you're going to die a horrible, miserable death or something like that. I think that's one thing. There are Facebook sites where people share their data that they got from Ancestry.com or 23andMe or MyHeritage or whatever. And that's another sort of, privacy hole that's hard to regulate. But I think the real question is, do we care? Why do you care about your genetic privacy? What does it mean to you? Other than the right to, like I started off with, the right to be the person who gets to tell everyone about your genetics, do we have real fears that this will be abused or misused? And if so, how so? I don't know if we actually have, I don't know if the average person has a real fear that their genetic information will somehow be used against them. I think it's much more likely that the last thing you posted on Instagram will be used against you. Rather than your, and I'm not commenting on Raghav's Instagram posts because they're amazing, and I've been following him for like years already. But I really think what we do on social media is much more intrusive and much more informative than our genetic information, and much more accessible, right? You need the tools You need someone who is malicious and has the tools to do it, right? That's government scale. There is a great emerging area of technology, I'm not going to go into details, but there's a great emerging area called cyber biosecurity, which is, using genetic information or hacking genetic information. It's an undefined sort of area, but it's really cool. I'd advise you to, if you're really interested in it, look into, it's either called cyber biosecurity or some people call it bio cybersecurity. It's called both because it doesn't really have a name yet. But it's a really cool area where I think this is where, if you're thinking of the next big thing in genetic privacy, where things will happen, it's this area to some degree.